So we started with a good thing. We'll remind ourselves about this unfortunate, horrible, catastrophic war, which continues. That there's a glimmer of hope today, tomorrow, perhaps that some breakthrough will happen, and there'll be a ceasefire, and the hostages, at least those that are alive, will be returned. Will come home. It has not been an uneventful week. We commemorated the other day the 9th of Av, Tisha B'Av, which is a magnet date for all sorts of catastrophic events. The Jewish people, from the first temple, the second temple, both being destroyed on the same day, according to tradition. The plowing of the Temple Mount and the destruction of Beitar and the Bar Kokhba revolt in the 2nd century. Numerous crusades and pogroms, and even World War I starting on Tisha B'Av because of the assassination, which led to World War II, which was the Holocaust. This is what you hear in certain traditional circles, that even essentially the Holocaust started on the 9th of Av, going back to the biblical story of when the Israelites the majority decided to accept the negative report from the 10 spies as opposed to the positive report from the 2 spies, Joshua and Caleb. And so it's one of those, whatever the opposite of auspicious days, or maybe auspicious can be negative as well, but it's one of those days, that time of year, and thank God we passed it. It had a special resonance this year because the horrible scenes, the gory scenes that are found in the liturgical poetry from the Middle Ages and in the Book of Lamentations, which is also read on the 9th of Av, we're no longer distant for many Israelis and many Jews. And that's on one hand. On the other hand, one of the members of the government in Israel decided again to make it a point to go up onto the Temple Mount and not only be there, which has happened on the 9th of Av every year since I can remember. There have been those Israelis that have insisted on going up to the Temple Mount, but also prayed there, and there was the largest number there's ever been, 3,000. They were very proud in saying this was the largest number of Jews on the Temple Mount since the destruction in 70. I don't know if that's true or not. I'm not. What I'm concerned with, of course, is the effect that it has on world peace and on the collective psyche of Muslims around the world who see this as a threat, especially when some of the members of that group insisted on not only bowing down but prostrating themselves the same way they would in the temple, but of course very reminiscent of what Muslims do in their own prayer. So a difficult time. Is it more difficult than last week or the week before? I don't know. Every week with its new difficulties, and sometimes we just have to giggle a little bit and laugh and let the pressure out. But is there something to be optimistic for? I think there always is. Again, I want to raise up the work that so many small, albeit small, but so many organizations of civil society continue to do, where Jews and Arabs, both Muslims and Christians and secular Arabs, work together for bettering the situation within the state of Israel and also within the territories, the occupied territories. So with that I think is the best prayer, the best internalization of a message, as we're going to talk about today. Sometimes is to partake of something, is to read, to immerse ourselves in the good news. That's how we internalize it, and that's, I think, at least for me, that's how I overcome what could be sometimes the hopelessness. Okay, I don't mean to give a sermon on this. I'm happy for other people to ask questions or make any comments about this bit.
What is Netanyahu's stock like right now? Is he rising, falling, same?
If you would have asked me, I'm always thinking it's falling. It can't fall any lower. But it was propped up with his performance in Congress. Even those that were dubious of him, it just felt like, well, that's what we need. We need a prime minister who can get what seemed from the pictures, almost the entire U.S. government on their feet clapping. You know, sometimes Israelis, speaking very generally, very stereotypically here, can be shallow in their assessment of American politics, and in this case of their prime minister's ability to manipulate to whatever to as he was accepted by American politicians, and that's all that's important. And so they get blinded. But I think that I don't know the polls. I don't bother reading Israeli. I don't do. I in general don't look at polls so much. But the feeling one gets in the press and thinkers that and contemporary historians is that his situation only gets worse. The Supreme Court ruled, not Supreme Court, the Attorney General yesterday or the day before once again reiterated that it is in the country's interest that his trials proceed. Um, Netanyahu's defense has said that while the war is going on, of course, this is not, it's unspeakable. Well, how could we possibly deal with Netanyahu's criminal activity or accused criminal activity during the war? The same thing with his partial admission of guilt in a Time magazine interview, but it wasn't really. It was basically, you know, blaming those around him, and of course nothing. There should be no inquiry whatsoever. So, in answer to your question, Steve, I don't. If there was a bump upwards after Washington D.C., I think now it's going back down, and we'll see. Knesset is on break right now. The Israeli Parliament. We'll have to see. In the meantime, one of the issues that continues to fester is the drafting of ultra-Orthodox of Haredi Israelis into the army, and that has been at a very, very low level, even though it's been decided by the high courts multiple times that it needs to go through. And there's been rioting around that. So that's what we have.
Sounds familiar.
Yeah. Okay. So we have we owe a debt to last week or to the last 2 weeks. We're going to take a look at the last paragraph in from verse 60 in verse 5 on last week's sheets. If you don't have those sheets, if you don't have that sheet, then maybe just open up a Bible or look online to chapter 5, 60. I'm sorry. Yeah, oh no, I'm wrong. I'm looking at the wrong sheet. chapter 5, verse 39. And it's in the chat box now. So I think Steve wanted to develop this a little bit more. This is difficult for us to understand coming from the outside and not being used to it as Jews. I think I'm speaking for all. It's difficult for me as a Jew coming from the outside to try to discern exactly what are the limits of where is God and where is Jesus in this. And the boundaries seem to float. And my guess is that is the intention. The intention is for it to be it's like a living bound. It's not hard set. There's a fluidity to it. But why don't we go ahead? Don, would you read the section for us from 39 to the end of the chapter, and then we'll open it up for discussion, or Steve will.
You search the scriptures because you think that in them you have eternal life, and it is they that testify on my behalf. Yet you refuse to come to me to have life. I do not accept glory from humans, but I know that you do not have the love of God in you. I have come in my Father's name, and you do not accept me. If another comes in his own name, you will accept him. How can you believe when you accept glory from one another and do not seek the glory that comes from the one who alone is God? Do not think that I will accuse you before the Father. Your accuser is Moses, on whom you have set your hope. If you believed Moses, you would believe me, for he wrote about me. But if you do not believe what he wrote, how will you believe what I say?
Frank, it looks like you have a smile on your face there.
No, it's not a smile, it's a grimace.
Frank.
Tough stuff.
Yeah. So I'd like to offer a bit of context for this. And first of all, John's gospel was pulled together in 5 successive stages from the the historical root in the 30s. And this last successive stage, which gives us the text as we now have it, most scholars believe was, let's say, 90, 20 years after the temple has been destroyed. And so now there is this sense in the community of John, which is a Jewish written and a Jewish, it's rooted in Judaism. And yet the shift between Jews who believe in Jesus as Christ, as Messiah, and Jews who believe in Jesus as Christ, but insist on legal observances like circumcision. And then, of course, Gentiles who have been grafted into the olive root of Judaism and are now part of the covenant. Well, 20 years after the destruction of the temple, a lot is going on. And there is a growing impatience on the part of the Jewish leadership, which is now basically Pharisaic rabbinical Judaism, if I understand that correctly. I mean, it's a shift to since there's no longer sacrifices in the temple, it's now these early Christians in the synagogues who believe in Jesus are getting pushback, and the Jewish mainstream are getting tired of those who believe in Jesus, because not only do they give Romans pretext to go after them, which they were under some kind of a dispensation, but if they're now being more and more associated with the pagans or with the Gentiles or other ethnic groups, then that becomes problematic. But also it had come to a head. And one of the curses or in the synagogue blessings or curses that are read at the beginning or in the context of synagogue worship, one was to pronounce anathema on the Christians. So if you're a Jew but also believe in Jesus and you're in the synagogue, if you can't read that with a clean conscience, then you have to leave. And we'll see in the Gospel of John, they're on the line. There's a lot of Jews who believe in Jesus, but they want the security of their culture, of their tradition. But now it's a crisis has been forced. And you're either now Christian by the 90s or Jewish. And that Jewish Christian blend is now more polarized. In John's gospel, we have a polemic. It's a polemical work against the Jews. But by Jews, John, I don't believe that John is anti-Semitic at all. He talks of Israel very positively, and he uses Jews in other contexts just as description. But when in the polemical passages, he talks about the Jews, he's talking about the leadership that is missing the forest for the trees, or however you want to put that their resistance and now active pushback against the Christians, it's just reached a pitch. And so this gospel tells us a lot about what's happening in 90 AD, maybe even more so than what was happening in 30 CE. So that's the context I wanted to present. And then the last text here that Don just read, the last verse was, but if you do not believe what Moses wrote, how will you believe what I say? We're going to see in the Gospel of John this systemic movement away from Jewish sacrifice, Jewish law. Jesus now becomes the embodiment of that as Messiah. So John is unapologetic about that. But I would submit that he's reaching universally. He's not, he's trying to talk about Jesus is the universal man for all nations, for the world. And so it's very, very complicated, but the fact is the tension here is from the Jewish point of view in the 90s is against having to believe Jesus as Messiah or else. See, they're pushed into that crisis, and that is a genuine problem that we have to talk about and work out.
Okay, so I want to push back a little bit, or to offer an alternative context or a contextual setting. I'm not sure that John represents all of Christianity in the end of the first century, or all the followers of Jesus. I think John represents one particular community or one particular stream of devotees to Jesus who see Jesus in this way as it's being presented in the final copy of or edition of John that we have. So I don't think it's Christianity against Judaism at this point. I think that happens 200-300 years later. What I think is happening now is a particular part of those believing Jews want to distinguish themselves from the rabbinic, Pharisaic rabbinic Judaism, and are doing it that way. So I want to, instead of seeing John as it is seen today, has been seen for 1,500 years or 1,000 years as representative of what happened in Christianity compared to Judaism, I'd isolate it as one particular area, that would be my, because we know, Stephen, you know as well, that there are communities around the world at that time and in the next 200 years that still have this very healthy or very robust synthesis of Judaism and belief in Christ as Messiah. What would you agree with that reframing?
Well, I mean, part of me, would you say it was Christians against Jews or Jews against Christians? I think in a way, John's community is feeling embattled by the mainstream. They're being pushed out. And you're right, this is written in Ephesus, or that's where the community, most scholars would say, that this comes out of. And you're right, in John's own gospel, there's Gnostics, there's other little groups, and after this gospel was written, the letters, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John in the New Testament are addressing, members of their own community who are not Jewish, who are believing all kinds of stuff. So it's really an effort to try and, what is it? What's the tradition? And how is Jesus's reinterpretation of that tradition as the new Moses?
Ajit, just one moment. I just want to finish this one point. We don't have evidence from the 1st century, or even the 2nd century for that matter, of an anti-Christian polemic in Judaism. That's a bit of an optical illusion. We have one blessing in the Amidah, the standing prayer, which is 3 times a day, that deals with the misfits, the evil of society. In some versions of that we have, the first ones we have that are in writing, if I remember correctly, 9th, 10th century from Geniza in Cairo, some of them have, and reference, sometimes it is to the Notzrim, and sometimes it's and sometimes it's the Minim, and sometimes it's the there's another one as well. It's whoever the candidate, whoever was a thorn in the side of of the people who were setting the liturgy at the time, that blessing became against them. So I think that's something, I think scholarship has moved on from that idea that already in the first, second century, there was a polemic against Christianity. So in any case, we don't have the answer to this. We only have this. And the final thing I'll say is that absolutely what one sees here and what one sees in the next chapter is not only Jesus as Messiah, and not only Jesus as God with this fungible kind of boundaries here, but also Jesus as Moses. Jesus is the replacement for Moses. Nothing new. We've seen this in other places as well. But that's what comes up here, and that certainly will come up in the next chapter. Ajit.
The way I read this, where he says, your accuser is Moses, he's essentially saying to the Jews, you're wrong. You should accept Jesus. And if you don't, Moses will accuse you. So this seems to me as a separation between the Jews and the Christians in the writings of John. I mean, John is in fact separating the groups between those that believe and those that don't believe in Jesus.
Yeah, but I think to me, it's more like a train of thought or a body of knowledge about which he is speaking here. He is in unity with Moses in this section, but I think we take the pronouns and give them today's meaning as opposed to the wider general ambiguous language of that time.
But what are you referring to in that last comment, Don? I don't follow. Which pronouns?
What I'm saying is, in that sentence, if you believe Moses, a body of knowledge, many thoughts, many expressions, many words, you would believe me because Jesus, is a follower of Moses. When Moses writes about, quote, me, he's writing about God. And Jesus is a follower of God. If you don't believe what Moses wrote, how will you believe what I say? So there is some sort of a transcendent, almost to me, code that's being spoken of with his words that aligns itself very nicely with the past. Now that's just my opinion. You can bash me around if you want.
David, were you saying, and thanks, Don, for that clarification, but were you saying that you don't sense that polemic in here, or that?
No,
There's a polemic.
I think it's an expression of between a group of people and Jesus who are trying to elevate Jesus into a position of power and authority, but he doesn't want to go there because he comes from this humble or more humble tradition where God is really the person who gets the glory, not him.
Yeah. And David, you were about to add to that or clarify?
No, I'm fine.
Well, it was Shaye Cohen back when I was studying Acts who introduced me to those anathemas, or I forget the formal name for them, and suggested that this is when the rupture was really, really happening, and Christians who were feeling pushed out of the synagogue, who were Jewish and forced to be non-Jewish by their declaration, which we'll see in John chapter 9, the healing of the blind man. That's where all that comes up. So I don't want us to belabor all this because we have so much text to go through, but I do want to suggest that this conflict is a universal conflict in any community or religion between those who may assert finalized what the Bible would call idolatrous worship versus a more inclusive, open-ended approach to the truth through spirit. So I think these are parables that help sharpen that understanding that can be applied across our faith traditions.
For me,
It's my
this
hope.
comes across from my personal experience, Steve. I grew up in Pakistan, a Muslim country, as a Hindu. And many of my Muslim friends would refer to talk about the kafirs, the infidels. Then they would turn around and look at me and say, well, of course, we're not calling you kafir. We're calling you general people who don't accept our religion as a kafir. And I would go, but I am one of those. Why, you're obviously talking about me without trying to say so. So it kind of, I'm touchy on this one.
Okay. Let's go on to the next chapter then.
May-
Oh, yes,
may
go
I-
ahead, please, Ellen.
I was trying to find you on the source sheet, and I think I'm a little lost. Could you tell me
Yeah,
what chapter?
yeah, we just finished last week's source sheet, but we're going on now to this week's source sheet that says at the top of it, Al Sfat Yam Kinneret, the gospel according to John chapter 6.
Okay, and what verse are you on?
We're just going to begin it now. We were
Oh,
finishing up
okay,
what we
okay.
left over from last week. Sorry about
Yeah.
that.
No worries. Thank
Okay,
you.
all right. So before we start this, just a few reflections. Sea of Galilee, which is the area that we're going to be at now. We were in Jerusalem beforehand with Jesus, and we were in Samaria with Jesus. We were, as an Israeli, as a kid visiting Israel already, when I was 15, and sleeping nights camping out on the shores of the Kinneret, and going up there whenever we had a chance, and swimming, Kinneret being the Hebrew name for the Sea of Galilee. And there's so much romanticism about it. That's why does anybody recognize those words that I put up there? Anybody from a Jewish background? No, it's from a song, Al Sfat Yam Kinneret. We actually use that melody, or I use that melody during the high holidays and part of our liturgy. And it's on the shores of the Sea of Galilee. And it's this very romantic poem from, it's classic Israeli folk music. So much about the Kinneret on the front page. I don't know if it's still like this, but for all the decades I lived in Israel, of Yediot Achronot, maybe not Haaretz, but of the more popular newspaper, in the corner there was, or on the side, there's always a picture of the Sea of Galilee and the water level, where it is, because drought and filling up. The water level of the lake is on the front page of the newspaper every single day. That's part. The first kibbutz that was ever created was Kibbutz Kinneret. Maybe it wasn't the first, or one of the first. No, the great poets of the early days of the state of Israel lived around that area, wrote around that area, and we kind of knew. And this is my point: as Israeli Jews, we kind of knew that there's Capernaum, right? Kfar Nachum. It took me a while to realize that Kfar Nachum, which is the village of Nahum, right, of Nachum, is Capernaum. And that I never went there. Why, there was no other reason, you saw it on the list, but that's where the Christian pilgrims would go. You see the Christian tour buses go there. Or on the other end of the Sea of Galilee, at the south end, there's an area which is very easy to do baptism. It became kind of a Christian tourist spot. Not in the Jordan River. It's actually at the mouth, is where the Jordan River flows out of the Sea of Galilee. So knowing that there was a Christian aspect of the sea, but never knowing any of the stories of anything else, and sometimes I take a step back, and I look in my own life, in my own lifetime stream of consciousness, where does the Sea of Galilee play a part? And now this of course, these are scenes that have their foundation in the synoptic gospels, and so this is not the only time we're seeing, but because as a group we're coming to this for the first time, I thought just to think about how central this Sea of Galilee, and there's been people living around the Sea of Galilee for millennia, because that's a source of water. Just how central it is to culture, to Christian culture, and essentially to Jewish culture as well. Maybe not Jewish culture in Eastern Europe, but certainly those that have a connection with Israel. And it's something to me, that's something that I'm looking for in this group as well, as we exchange views and we grow together. It would be so important if we were able. It would be so wonderful if we were able, as a group, as we've talked many times, to tour, and then Israel. And then I would very much want to spend a day on the shores of the Kinneret to hear about these stories. Now, at the top, the northern end of the Kinneret, there's this hillside that goes up. It's now called the Mount of Beatitudes, even though in some of the traditions, the Beatitudes were recited on a plain, in the fields, I think, but not on the mountain. But still, there's that mountain at the end. So I can't read this without thinking, and I know it from all directions, from the Golan Heights, from the mountains above Tiberias. So that's kind of, so I'm not talking about history right now. I'm talking about personal experience. So thanks for indulging me with that. Let's see.
And before we get into 6, David, I want Ellen, her question reminded me of just to orient ourselves in where we are. The so-called Book of Signs, begins, with that first sign at Cana that we read in chapter 2, and then it goes all the way through to the second sign at Cana. So those are bookends. Now we're in so-called part 3, which is Jesus and the principal feasts. And so last week, 5, was the Sabbath, right? And this week is Passover. And then in future, then we'll get to the tabernacles and the other feast in these next all the way up to chapter 12. So we're now in that feast cycle.
And that format supports the approach to this book, as this is now a replacement of traditional Judaism. That format of visiting all the holidays, going through Moses being key, this theological discussions. Yeah. Okay. So do we have a volunteer to read this first paragraph? Steve.
I'll be happy. Oh,
Yep, I got
And then afterwards, Rita Claire, you read the next section, okay?
it. Chapter 6. After this, Jesus went to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, also called the Sea of Tiberias. A large crowd kept following him because they saw the signs that he was doing for the sick. Jesus went up to the mountain and sat down there with his disciples. Now the Passover, the festival of the Jews, was near. When he looked up and saw a large crowd coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread for these people to eat?" He said this to test him, for he himself knew what he was going to do. Philip answered him, 200 denarii would not buy enough bread for each of them to get a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what are they among so many people?" Jesus said, "Make the people sit down." Now there was a great deal of grass in the place, so they sat down, about 5,000 in all. Then Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated. So also the fish, as much as they wanted. When they were satisfied, he told his disciples, "Gather up the fragments left over, so that nothing may be lost." So they gathered them up, and from the fragments of the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten, they filled 12 baskets. When the people saw the sign that he had done, they began to say, "This is indeed the prophet who has come into the world."
Hey. Reflections.
When I read this before the session today, and even reading it again now, this part where he's asking Philip about going to buy bread to test him, I was wondering, why is he picking Philip to test him, and what's he testing him about?
Yes.
A cynical way of looking at this would be that the original story was that Philip asked him, and then a later narrator or a later editor added, "Oh, that was just to test him. It's not as if he didn't know." That's a cynical way of reading this. That's my training in biblical scholarship is to see this as a later comment, but because yeah. Otherwise, I have no answer to you. How about anybody else have an answer to that?
Testing Philip's faith.
So why Philip?
Testing of his faith, you said?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Does he really believe that Jesus could multiply the loaves? Does he really believe that or not? Perhaps, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, negatively, it feels manipulative, right? But positively, in the wider context of faith, because see, it's this faithing as a verb that transcends and universalizes this message. And so I understand John to be talking about faithing as a sixth sense. You know, we have hearing, seeing, touching, the whole bit, but faithing is through the eye of the heart.
Huh.
And what he is saying is those who get that revelation of faithing see, but and for those with the eyes to see, let them see, as he keeps saying over and over again. So it's that mystical element that comes in. So yeah, maybe he is discerning his faith capacity, or but it's hard to say.
So a few things come out from a Jewish point of view, rabbinic point of view, perhaps I'll point out as my role and some questions. The time of Passover. It says the Passover was coming. It doesn't say exactly that it is Passover, was near. What does that mean? The day before. So the first question that would come out, so what is bread here? Now, some people feel, well, you can't have bread on Passover, but that's not exactly the case. The word for bread covers matzah as well. There's bread which is leavened and there's bread which is unleavened. So that wouldn't be a problem, although that doesn't seem to be the focus here. In fact, that seems not to be the focus. This is not about chametz. This is not an opportunity for Jesus to say, well, don't worry, you don't have to keep those laws anymore. In fact, it's about feeding the people. And before you feed the people, what does Jesus do before he feeds them?
He gives thanks.
Which is what in the Jewish tradition?
Motzi.
It's either a motzi or some form of birkat hamazon. The source on the back, just if you want to flip over quickly, from the Babylonian Talmud, which is based around the verse in Deuteronomy that says, "And you shall eat, and you shall partake, you shall eat, you shall be satisfied, and you shall bless." As the sages taught, the typo there, sanctified for praises before the Lord, which is in Leviticus. This verse teaches that they require praise of God in the form of a blessing both before and thereafter partaking of bread. As the verse says, praises in plural. From here, Rabbi Akiva said, a person is forbidden to taste anything before he recites a blessing. I mention this because it's interesting. I say a blessing before everything I eat, but I usually just say it to myself. I don't make a big deal out of it if I'm with other people. We do at the Sabbath table. That's part of the ritual. But when I'm out with my pastor friends and the pastor and priest friends, we'll always say a prayer together, even if just the two of us. And it's a prayer beforehand, not afterwards. The basic, for those that don't know, the basic or the not the brunt, but the heavy prayer is the prayer after bread. We do say a prayer beforehand, as Rabbi Akiva said. We don't benefit from anything without saying a blessing, not only for bread or for eating, but for eating and drinking, but also for smelling something aromatic or for seeing something special or expressing something. We have this liturgy of blessings, of giving praise. But the heavier prayer comes after one has a meal with bread, which is Birkat Hamazon. That doesn't seem to be it here, but there was a discussion in Talmudic times where that goes, before or afterwards, you see. Okay, that's just, so this is very much, saying the prayer is a very much Jewish thing to say. I'm not sure, I know that, I don't know if that we have Buddhists with us, but I know that many Buddhists who are practicing Buddhists will take a moment to, to give thanks beforehand as well. But it's not the same. Okay. All right. Enough with that. The 12 baskets, most probably you're representing the symbolic of the 12 tribes. I was a little bit taken by why do we need to know the detail of the grass?
Mhm.
Why is the grass there? Well,
Shepherd.
I hadn't thought of that. That's interesting. That's cool.
Good,
I like
Ron.
that idea. Very nice. Yeah. Some commentaries point out, well, it was springtime, it's Passover. That's when there's grass, it's Passover, as opposed to it being dry in the summertime when things. But that led me to believe also of religion in general in the land of Israel, in the ancient land of Israel, very much influenced by Canaanite culture before biblical culture, and in the Canaanite culture, as some of you know, there's this eternal battle between Baal, the god of fertility and of I'm not talking the biblical derogatory way of talking about Baal, but in Canaanite literature, Baal is the god of fertility, god of rain, thunder, lightning, and rain, and his arch nemesis, who is Mot, who is the god of death, and Mot is the one who causes the world to be dead in the summer. His name in other places in the ancient Near East was Damuzi or Tammuz. In fact, the month before the month we're in now, the Hebrew month is really, the names of the months are not Hebrew, they're Babylonian gods' names, deities. And before is Tammuz, because Tammuz was the god who ruled over this time of year where everything is dry. If you live in California, Southern California, you know the same thing. And so perhaps the grass here is something about life as well. It's a symbol for life. I'm not sure, but it seems to be an odd detail that we don't really need for the story. The other thing that struck me is that it's Jesus who gives out the bread himself, right? As opposed to in the other gospels, correct me if I'm pretty sure that in the synoptic gospels, the parallel stories here, the apostles are the one that give out the bread. Jesus empowers. Pretty sure that's the case. And here it's Jesus giving out. And it could have been Spong who pointed out this is instead of the Last Supper, which does not appear in the Gospel according to John, and this fills that role as Jesus feeding his people, literally feeding them. I like that idea also, as having them a pastor, as you said, Don. One last thing, the remnant, that nothing must be lost. In verse 12, when they were satisfied, he told us, gather up the fragments left over so that nothing may be lost. So fragments some debate amongst scholars, is it the crumbs that are left over or is it the leftover bread? And one easy way to understand this is that it's to show us that there's more than enough, right? Which is the more, very much more than enough. This, of course, is reflective of Moses bringing the manna to the people, being instrumental in bringing the manna to the people, which comes up in the conversation after this. But there's another element to it, and that is when something's left over from a sacrifice, for instance, the Passover, the Paschal lamb, you've got to gather it up. You can't just throw it out. It has to be all consumed or burned. There's not that whatever.
Which is what that same idea is in the Eucharist in the Episcopal Church, right?
Exactly.
You have to consume all the elements.
And the cleaning of the cross. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. And again, this is the Eucharistic motion, right? He takes and he blesses and then gives. Right. And so I think it's inescapable. It's an inescapable connection. But I get excited when it's another instance of like in Numbers 11, Moses asked Yahweh, where am I going to get meat to give all these people? So the parallels are
Yeah.
are there.
In fact, if you want to read chapter 11, Numbers 11, and you'll see there's about 7 or 8 different things that are this is very much set on that way. And by the way, there too, the meat that comes out is so much that they were sick of it. There was so much. Yeah.
Yeah, the other thing is the 12 baskets are symbolic of the 12 tribes.
Yeah. Yeah. So one question I guess I have for Steve and for the other scholars who've spent time on it, how much do we see this as a reflection of a possible practice of Eucharist, or is this just what the Eucharist is based upon?
No, I mean, my take is that Paul speaks of this much earlier, right, in the 50s. And so I think my understanding in early Jewish Christian history was that since Shabbat, as soon as they could on Sunday morning, it's also the day the scripture says Christ was resurrected, but that's also as soon as they could gather and then practice the Eucharist feast, as emblematic or as symbolic or as a participation in Jesus's work, and so Sunday morning became kind of the day for church and Eucharist.
So I'll just read, I'm not sure I understood. So in your mind, is this reflecting a predominant practice, at least in this community, this story comes
Yeah.
to the basis for the contemporary practice? Okay.
I think so. Yeah. As
Alan?
opposed to inspiring the practice, is that?
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think practice has been going on for at least 30 years.
Okay. Ellen?
I have 2 questions. One is, when you talk about the 12 baskets, could that also be for the 12 apostles? Weren't there 12 apostles?
Very
In
much so.
12 tribes, right?
It would be an echo, though. See, the apostles don't really play a part so much in this story as they do in the others, right?
Yeah.
So it could be an echo of that, a reflection of that,
And what were you referring to when you talked about the crumbs of the Eucharist? What is the practice about that?
For me, Ellen?
When you said I think you said the
Yeah. At the end of
Episcopalian.
every Eucharist, then it's just the custom, as long as I've been a priest since 1985, to consume all the elements. So if there's extra bread or the wafers, then we consume that. Or we put it into the reserved sacrament box, but it's consecrated. And so you can't leave anything that's been consecrated. So a lot of alcoholic priests fill up that cup with extra wine because that's a freebie, No, I'm kidding. But it happens.
Don?
Yeah, I was going to say in the Catholic tradition, there is a sink that does not lead to a sewer system, but leads to the ground to
That's
dispose
right.
of elements, both flakes from the Eucharistic host and also from residual wine left in the cup.
Yeah.
We have the same idea. I don't know if you can see, if you look in the corner of that area, which is like of a bar, there's my dry lulav, my palm frond from Sukkot. So those that know what they're looking for see it. It's like this white sword kind of a thing. That, and you'll see in some of my books, old fringes from a talit that's torn as a bookmarker. There's things we also don't throw out. Either we bury them or we use them for something else. The custom with a lulav, so this is not about eating, but it's because it's been sanctified. The palm frond that you shake and the etrog, we keep them dry and we smell them afterwards. But you're supposed to use your lulav to burn your leavened bread before Passover. You use it in the fire because you're doing a mitzvah with a mitzvah. So there's that same idea of sanctification. So I have to tell a Eucharist story. I mean, I have a number of my favorite rabbinic Eucharist stories, and one of them is when sorry. One of them is when I was the first or second time I've helped. I was part of the officiating, not officiating, but I was reading from scripture in Sweden, Stockholm, for the love mass, Kärleksmassa. Anyway, the love mass was a Sunday morning of Pride weekend every August, and it just happened as I was reminded of it. And there would be many priests there, and the cathedral was full. It was packed. I mean, there were thousands of people, I guess, and they would break into different areas, and so there would be multiple stations. And a Jewish member of one of the choirs came up to me and she said, "You should be giving out challah, right? I should give, the Friday, the Shabbat bread while they're giving, you should be here like with Kiddush wine and challah." I said, that's a little bit too much appropriation. Okay, I'm sorry if that wasn't funny to people. I thought it was pretty funny. Instead, I did give her a blessing though, and then by the last year I was there were a number of Jews that came up to me for a blessing at that time. But I got clearance from the dean. He said it was all right. My buddy, the dean. Okay. All right. Shall we, anything else? Rich paragraph. Anything else before we go on?
I want to see if Frank has worked out his consternation.
I'm working on it.
Okay. All right.
I was interested in David's comment about scholarship seemed to suggest that for a century or two anyway, after John's time, there was less hostility among Jews toward Christians than sometimes has been portrayed. Is that right?
No, let me clarify. There is no Jewish body to have a position, right? And there's really no Christian body to have a position until what year? In the 4th century? When do you have your first synod start to happen? So for us to think about Judaism versus Christianity as things, as entities, is not really support. I don't think it's a thought of it by many scholars to be supportive anymore. And it's no longer the parting of ways, which used to be spoken about, which perhaps, I mean, sometimes it feels like, as Stephen Kinney is describing, this is the encapsulation of the parting of ways. Many scholars today, and there, albeit younger scholars, are saying that, the parting of ways was not at one time. It took a few hundred years. And so I'm not an expert at this. I try to read a little bit about it, and it's on my pile of books, that kind of stuff. I get a little bit lost, but you find in I don't know if it's 3 Enoch or whatever, different apocryphal books. There's evidence of this synthesis between, or not synthesis, what's the word? Synchronism, syncretism of Judaism.
Synchronicity.
Thank you. Yeah, between Judaism and Christianity, not everywhere, in some communities. So I think my position is that I'm not comfortable with speaking about the Jewish position and the Christian position, right? Yeah, I think.
Yeah, David, I really appreciate that. And you're exactly right that it wasn't until the 4th century that this got so politically involved. I'm just saying it's implicit in here.
Absolutely.
That growing tension over the nature of faith, the nature of religion, the nature, and who in the hell is Jesus? What is this person who is embodying so much, who is replacing Moses? Not replacing because he followed Moses, but he's trying to, the New Testament, the New Covenant folks are trying to appeal to Jews and Christians to be reconstituted. And after the temple, it was all bets off, right? I mean, things were in chaos. We didn't know how the cards were going to fall.
Let me ask a question, Steve. Is Jesus replacing Moses, or some of the followers of Jesus saying he is replacing Moses? Because Jesus does not ever say, "I'm replacing Moses."
No. And I didn't mean to imply that, Ajit, and thanks for giving me the chance. No, he believes, at least the New Testament community believes, he's fulfilling Moses. in the law. He's the true interpretation of Moses. Let's put it that way.
Okay, except for, yes, and in this particular chapter, as it was hinted at, what Jesus is doing now is a Mosaic job, Mosaic, right? The giving
Yeah.
of the bringing the bread. Water isn't brought here, but it could have been brought. So giving the bread. And the next thing, which I don't think we're going to get to today, is that Jesus does something else, which is very Mosaic-like or very Moses-like. And that has to do with walking upon the water. So you could understand that as being fulfilling Moses, or you could understand it being as replacing Moses in the new idea, in the same way that the New Testament replaces the Old Testament. I think they can all be true for different people, or maybe for the same person at different times. But I don't. It seems like the author of John wants us, though, to be at least be confused. It's like Jesus and God. I think for me the goal is there is a desired confusion. Maybe a better word could be used, but yeah, you're not happy with that answer, Ajit.
I do think
No.
next. Oh, Ajit, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I'm basically saying that if in fact this be true, then the station of Moses as a prophet, for example, and I don't know if we use the term prophet to describe Moses, but we're using far greater terms to describe Jesus, not just as a prophet, but as a son of God, a son of man, etc. So it's not identical. The terminology used perhaps in the 4th century after Nicaea, the terminology changes tremendously.
True, but and I know we're out of time, but next week we should see just how John and the community of John is reinterpreting Moses in the person of Jesus, where we'll see in Deuteronomy and in Isaiah almost exact references to what Jesus is doing. He's reenacting Moses, reinterpreting Moses in a way that I think Jews, Buddhists, I think all religions, if we can stay away from that exclusivist or that unless, then we'll see maybe some wisdom that emerges through this in a way that builds up all communities. So anyway.
Harold, did you have a comment?
Yeah. Well, when I read the last sentence of this, where it says, they began to say, this is indeed the prophet who is come into the world. And I interpret not just them saying it, but that the author of this is also saying it. That this is indeed the prophet come into the world, which is not to say, which could be, this is the Messiah, this is the one we've been waiting for. It could be a prophet, but it's not saying that Jesus is God. And my confusion comes in the previous chapter, the one we talked about at the beginning, 39, where it says verse 39, where Jesus is saying, I have come in my Father's name, and you do not accept me. Okay, so I've come in my Father's name. That is not the same thing as saying it's not necessarily a Trinity idea. But then when he says, how can you believe when you accept glory from one another? Do not seek the glory that comes from the one who alone is God. Now, it sounds to me that the one, he is referring to himself. And if he's saying the one who alone is God, then that's like a forerunner of the notion of the Trinity.
So
Yeah.
Harold, I'm going to suggest you hold on to that idea. Next week, we're going to get into even more blurring of the lines between who's responsible for the bread and what does it mean to partake of the bread. Just one thing for us all to remember is what we've been saying, according to Spong, both of us have said, this is not literal reading. None of these were meant to be literal stories. They're all symbolic. And perhaps
They're parables.
they're parables in a different format. Yeah, kind of. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, yeah. So good. So yes, Ellen.
Just one other question. Where in our Jewish texts does it tell us about the Messiah?
Oh, there's not just one text. There's multiple texts from the historiographical works themselves about David and God, telling David that it's David's line, which is going to be the anointed ones, the Mashiach ones. There's multiple texts in prophetic literature. So we don't have just one text. And basically the overlying message is that there will come a time when the King of Israel, who is the anointed one, who is from the house of David, will lead the armies of Israel in battle against the heathens, those that do not accept God as the one God. And while the goal is not for the world to become Jewish, so to speak, but the goal is for all of humanity to believe that God, Adonai, is the only God. But for another time, okay?
Thank you.
Thanks for being here, everybody.
Bye-bye.
And I would just say, Harold, love what you said, and I think you've raised the bar. That's what we got to talk about what that all that the nature of Jesus is. I love that question.
This is part of what David referred to earlier as desired confusion, I think. Is
Good.
Okay. All right. Bye-bye.
All right. Bye-bye.
Right.